I'm tempted myself, I have to admit. It's often more interesting down there than up here, they tell us afterwards, don't they? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please sit down. Thank you for the invitation to be here, Whitney. As you may have, if you read the bulletin already, I'm from the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, and we have such an extraordinary set of relationships with this parish. Trustees, students, rector, one of our proud products, so it's great to be with you. It's been a week when the religious among us haven't had to wish that we were in the news. It was quite a religious week, wasn't it? I was in New York on Thursday. The Pope never called. I missed out. I thought about suggesting to Whitney that since I was coming as a visitor this morning, that you might be able to say, well, you know, you probably gathered where I'm from, right? I'm Australian. And I thought, well, what if we suggested in the bulletin that there would be a visitor who was a foreigner who came from a country in the southern hemisphere that began and ended with an A, and who had an accent and wore white on Sundays? You're getting the idea? It just seemed probably to be too much of a letdown by the time you actually got here. But the Pope's presence in this part of the world in the last few days has been interesting and I think inspiring. We were talking, some of us, in the coffee hour in between about the fact that we Anglicans don't have a pope, and we don't have this kind of rock star phenomenon that we can put out the front for people to say, wow, Anglicanism must be great because they've got this guy. Well, as somebody said even before I did, there were other reasons we decided not to have a pope. However, we can all be thankful for the witness of this particular bishop, can't we? This Bishop of Rome, who reminds us of the extent of the mission of God's church, the fact that it comes in many forms, in many parts of the world. And I'm grateful for many of the things that he said before Congress, before the United Nations and otherwise, including, for instance, the strong emphasis he placed upon the need for us to respond to all those in the deepest need, wherever they find themselves in the world. And he used as an example, in more than one of his public pronouncements, of course, the terrible events that have been going on in the Middle East and the resulting outflow of refugees from Syria in particular, which provides us with an immediate challenge to think about what it actually means to engage with people in the deepest need. Him thinking about Syria also led me to think about another person whose life or death, in fact, dominated the news in the early part of this month. On the night of September the 2nd, a group of Kurdish refugees from Syria crowded onto a boat just on a beach in southwestern Turkey, a boat that was only intended for about a dozen people, one of these inflatables with an outboard motor. They crowded 25 or 30 people onto it, and they went out onto a choppy sea, and only a mile or two into their journey, they hoped to freedom and fullness of life, the boat capsized. And half of those on board were drowned. Just one of dozens of such incidents that have been going on, except that a particular poignant image captured the imaginations and pulled at the heartstrings of many of us. I read about this story before I saw the image myself, and it sounded so terrible and sad, I actually tried to avoid the image itself, the photo, but it eventually popped up on my electronic news reading, as I'm sure it did for many of you. A little boy who looked just like many other little boys who'd been playing on the beaches of Connecticut during the past summer, who looked as if he'd just dug one sandcastle too many, or had just played one too many games with a bat and ball on the beach and had just gone clunk onto the sand to sleep. It was only the absence of the beach towel that a mother might have tucked under his head and the fact that his head was a little too close to the water to be safe that would actually have told us that little Aylan Kurdi, this 3-year-old Syrian refugee, had in fact been among those who were on that boat and had drowned. Aylan's story also came back to me as I read the Gospel for today. The connection is a bit indirect, but what it made me think of first is one of these very difficult sets of sayings that are bundled into the middle of the gospel today. That if any of you puts a stumbling block in front of one of these little ones who believes in me, it would be better if you had a great millstone tied around your neck and were thrown into the deepest ocean. Little Alan didn't choose to put any stumbling blocks in anybody's way, rather they were put in his way by the circumstances of his life. And yet he found himself cast into the deepest ocean by the cruelty of those circumstances, by, in effect, the stumbling block of human indifference and the reality of cruelty and violence from which his family was fleeing. That was, in effect, the great millstone that was around his neck as he ended his life. This is one of a set of difficult sayings sandwiched in the middle of the gospel today. I looked at the gospel today and I thought, this is why they've asked for a visiting preacher. So the first one about, if you put a stumbling block in front of these little ones, better if you have a great millstone cast around your neck and thrown into the sea. Great. And then it gets worse though, doesn't it? If your eye or your foot or your hand offends you, cut it off, pluck it out. Better to enter into life without hand or foot or eye than to be thrown into hell intact with hand and foot and eye? What on earth are we to make of this? Well, of course, one of the things we do is we wrap it in a gospel reading for Sunday with a couple of nice things at the beginning or the end. So let's concentrate, shall we, on whoever gives someone a glass of water in my name will not lose their reward. Good. Whew. And then at the end, have salt in yourselves. Be salt. Yes, okay, good. All right. I'm sorry, I'm stuck with the ones in the middle. I've already mentioned them now, so it's too late, isn't it? We're going to have to say something about them. These sayings of Jesus may not have originated all at the same time. They've been gathered together perhaps because the difficult ones all share a particular word or idea. It doesn't come through quite so obviously in the English, but the English at least still has the word stumbling in all of them. If any of you puts a stumbling block in the way of these little ones, better to be thrown into the ocean with a millstone around your neck. And then the others all say, if your hand or your foot or if your eye causes you to stumble. There's a common Greek word underlying all those sayings. It's actually the same as our English word scandal. Skandalon is this Greek word for a stumbling block. I'm telling you that Greek word to prove that I'm a seminary professor, right? You got that? But in all those cases, the idea of stumbling over something comes up. The idea of there being an obstacle which is on the way and which prevents one from going where one should or doing what one must. In the case of the stumbling block put in front of the little ones and the millstone hung around the neck, you begin to see that there's actually a kind of balance going on in the two halves of the saying. Because the millstone, you see, is, I think we're supposed to imagine, the thing that someone trips over. If you put an obstacle in the way of these little ones who are coming to the kingdom, then the thing that you've made an obstacle for someone is the thing that's hung around your neck and that causes grief for you. That idea doesn't flow through into hand or foot or eye, which remain difficult. But let me suggest one thing. In fact, it seems to me that the case of the Syrian crisis and the terrible things that are going on in Syria and Iraq actually do help us a little bit to think about what Jesus is saying. Because one of the horrendous aspects of this, and again something that I've tried to avoid seeing the way social media puts it in front of us, is the way in which so many people have not only lost their lives through terrible acts of deliberate cruelty and viciousness, but also others are mutilated, for instance, literally, by the cruelty of others. You may remember that when the terrible events of the Rwandan genocide went on, that the people who went on murderous rampages trying to kill or otherwise hurt members of the other ethnic group often took machetes with them and literally cut off people's hands or arms or feet or legs. And there are still many people today in Rwanda who are in modes of rehabilitation who are recovering from the effects of having literally been mutilated. Now, why do I raise these two examples to imagine they help us understand this story? It's because the world in which Jesus lived was a world of oppression and violent rule. That people who opposed Roman rule or who carried out various kinds of crimes might well have expected that through violence, cruelty, active or passive, they may well have found themselves, in fact, mutilated, having physical, permanent disability done to them by acts of violence. I imagine that when Jesus says to a crowd, better to go into life one-eyed than to be thrown into hell with two eyes, that there are some people who are listening to him who only have one eye. And that when he says better to go into life with one foot, there are some people who've had to shuffle along with some difficulty to hear him who literally only had a foot or a leg, barely the one to stand on, and so forth. We, of course, do have experiences of disability and need in our own lives and our own realities, but there, I suspect, the visceral character of the reality of physical oppression, of torture and violence was such that when he talks about people who have hand, eye or foot lost, there are people who know exactly what he's talking about without having to resort to metaphor. He's not advocating that we should perform such acts upon ourselves. Far from it. But rather acknowledging that those who have suffered such experiences are people who can nonetheless have freedom and fullness of life if their focus is not so much on the loss of hand or foot or eye, but upon the life to which we are all called. The common thread in all those difficult sayings is that idea of stumbling. In each case, there is the physical implication that there is something, a rock, an obstacle, a physical barrier, which prevents the journey to life into which Jesus calls us all. And as I said, in that particularly difficult metaphor of the millstone being hung around the neck of the perpetrator and thrown into the deeper sea, the character of the stumbling block as a great stone, a great round stone. You ever seen a millstone? This great stone is brought into our mind's eye quite directly by Jesus in the case of that particular saying. There's only one other time that I can think of where a great round stone plays a significant place in the gospel story. When Jesus himself, who was proven to be a stumbling block to the so-called righteous and to the powerful and to those who would not listen to his message, when Jesus himself is done away with, when they think that they have cast him into the deep ocean of death, when they think that they have mutilated his body sufficiently that he represents no more threat to them, he is laid dead and without hope, apparently, in a tomb, and a great stone is rolled across the entrance. And yet we are here. We are here because that stone, that ultimate obstacle, that stone that says that there is no way back from death, has been rolled away. No longer obstacle, no longer stumbling block, no longer millstone, no longer burden, but rather a door, a way that is open, a way to that life into which Jesus calls us, a way to that place where there is water for every thirsty person who needs it, to that place where we have salt in ourselves and where we can live as Jesus calls us to. The forms this new life takes for us are many and varied. Each of us knows what that millstone we've had to cut around from our own necks is in order to live as Jesus wants us to. Each of us knows what part it is of ourselves that we have had to rid ourselves of in order to make progress towards the life towards which he calls us. But Jesus calls us on to life, past the stumbling blocks, over the stumbling blocks, onward, forward. And the greatest stone, the greatest millstone, the greatest round obstacle in the world cannot prevent Jesus from calling us to the freedom and fullness of life which is his gift. And as we live our own lives and we see the concrete needs of others, of the refugees, of the disabled, of all those in our midst who have those needs for that cup of water, for that salt, for that light, we are reminded that it is not only that he tells us that we should act in certain ways, but that he has acted in our lives, removed our own stumbling blocks, rolled away and cut away the stones, and given us the way forward to freedom and fullness of life, so that we can pursue our journey, wherever it may take us, towards the life into which we are all called by him. The Lord be with you.